Hey students, welcome back to Chapter 5, Part 1. You say you want a revolution? Well, today we are going to talk about the beginning of the American Revolution. And we're going to talk about some of the things that led up to the crisis that did create the American Revolution, the events that lead up to that. So let's get started. So here we are going to begin with talking about the Stamp Act, and then we're going to get into some of the other acts of Parliament that were angering the colonists. We're going to talk about the Boston Massacre and some of the ways in which the colonists were organized to resist the British during this time period. And then we're going to talk about the very beginning of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. Okay, so in our last video, we talked about the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, and we talked about the impact of that war had on British society, and particularly how it affected the American colonists. So the first thing is, of course, this enormous financial strain that the 7 Years' War puts onto the British government. So they are trying to recoup their losses, and by just doing that, they are going to tax the colonists. The second thing is that there is this rift that takes place between the colonists and the British government because the British government believes that some of the colonists undermined the war effort during the French and Indian War. And then, of course, you have the Royal Proclamation line that was drawn as a result of Pontiac's rebellion. And that line was drawn in 1763, and that is going to anger the colonists as well, particularly the ones that want to have opportunity to settle into these frontier regions and to gain land and fortune, etc. So we're going to talk now about the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1765, and essentially it was a way for them to generate revenue. And so what they did is they decided to put a tax on all paper related to any kind of official documents. So it's not like a stamp like we would think of today, like a postage stamp or something like that. The stamp in this case is actually more like a seal, as you see here in this image. So it's like a seal, and this seal was put on all of the official papers in where the tax had been paid. So in other words, an official paper would not be accepted unless it had this seal that indeed a tax had been paid on that paper. So what types of papers? Well, playing cards, newspapers, pamphlets, court documents, licenses, wills, ship cargo logs. All of these official types of papers were used a lot by merchants and people that owned businesses. So this is going to be a really burdensome, particularly for merchants and for people that own businesses, for people that own shipping companies, etc. So this sets off a debate, a political debate in the colonies about this idea of taxation without representation. See, in the British Parliament, you had all of these different regions of England being represented, but there were no representatives in the British Parliament from the American colonies. This was beginning to anger the colonists because the colonists felt like they should be able to have a say in what types of laws were being passed by the British Parliament. The British and the Parliament argued back that all of the colonists throughout the British Empire had something that they called virtual representation. In other words, you're not actually represented, but you're kind of virtually represented because you were part of this broader British Empire. So they did not feel the need or the necessity to have representatives in their parliament from the colonies. Instead, they said, "Look, you should be happy. You should be grateful to be part of this great, British Empire." And at the time, the British Empire was becoming much more powerful than it had been in the past, and in fact, it was even surpassing the Spanish Empire, which at one point was the most powerful empire on the planet. Now you have the British Empire that is going to surpass that in terms of European empires, I should say. So the Stamp Act is going to cause a lot of anger and the colonists. And again, it starts this political debate, which eventually is going to lead to the American Revolution. Now, the Stamp Act is one of many taxes that were put on the colonists, but the Stamp Act was the one that impacted the majority of the population. So there were some other taxes like a sugar tax, and there was a molasses tax, and there were like some of these other more specialized taxes that the Parliament was passing. But as I said, the Stamp Act is really the one that's going to impact the most people, which then is going to cause the most anger, which then is going to spark the most debate. Okay, so the colonists decide that they are going to start to organize these resistance groups. And these groups are basically arguing that the colonists deserve to have representation in Parliament, that they are part of this. Keep in mind, of course, that the colonies were very used to this self-governance, right? They had their own elected officials. They had their own colonial assemblies that passed laws. And so they were very sort of politically independent minded people. And so they were very upset by the fact that they felt like the Parliament was disconnected politically from the colonists. So Patrick Henry, the famous, Virginia patriot, writes something called the Virginia Resolves. And in this, he talks about the power of the colonies as being independent political bodies. And this was a very powerful and a very concise argument that the colonies themselves could potentially be independent. Now, he was in no way at this particular point advocating for independence from England. He was simply stating that the colonies had been functioning as these independent political bodies since their founding, and so they needed to be recognized for that. He authors the Virginia Resolves. The Virginia Resolves are actually printed and circulated throughout the colonies. So keep in mind also that the American colonists, were very literate compared especially to other places in Europe. The American colonists had very high literacy rates. So, and even if you couldn't read, oftentimes these political pamphlets were read out loud in the public square. The other organization that's going to be founded during this time period, and by this time period I'm talking about the 1760s, is the Sons of Liberty. And this is a fraternal organization that was created originally in Boston, Massachusetts, and it was in direct response to these new tax laws. A lot of these members of the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty actually were a very sort of diverse group in terms of their economic status. So you did get people who were wealthy, who were merchants, who were successful business people, but you also got some of the, workers and just, average people who felt like they wanted to resist this taxation without representation. And the Sons of Liberty also decide that they are going to carry out a series of resistance acts. So not only are they writing these petitions of resistance, but they are also carrying out attacks. And one example is an attack on the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. Now, keep in mind, Massachusetts now is a royal colony, right? So this is a governor who has been appointed by the king, by the Parliament. They've got a lot of authority, and so they attack this guy, Thomas Hutchinson's house. They also start to hang effigies of people, and This is an example here in this image of an effigy, and an effigy is essentially like a life-size doll of somebody, and it's supposed to be created in their likeness, and then they're hung, or they're, some kind of violent act is done to them. Maybe they're tied to, a whipping post and they're beat, or whatever, but it's supposed to be a warning to people. And so these effigies of people like tax collectors were being hung up by the Sons of Liberty. So the Sons of Liberty were not only sort of, peacefully resisting this, but they were very actively and aggressively resisting these English tax laws. The other favorite activity of the Sons of Liberty was something called tarring and feathering. And this is where you can see here in this particular image here, you've got somebody who has been tarred and feathered, essentially covered with hot tar and then chicken feathers or whatever stuck all over their body. This would not only be painful, but it would stick for quite some time. So it would take a long time for the feathers and the tar to wear off. And so this was a real warning to people who wanted to engage in these types of activities, such as tax collecting or perhaps engaging in the tea trade, as you see here from this particular image. Okay, so as the Sons of Liberty are protesting the Stamp Act and their numbers are growing, and you're starting to see, colonial towns all over having these groups of Sons of Liberty. This issue of liberty and property really is at the heart of what these colonial demands were. The idea was that it made sense to Americans to have political liberty and to have access to property. Property, remember, gave them access, gave them a political voice, because in order to vote, not only did you have to be a white male, but you also had to be a white male that owned property. And so the Stamp Act, again, sets off this debate about representation in Parliament, and this idea that, taxes were a gift to the monarch in exchange for rights, in exchange for property, in exchange for liberty. And so this gets carried over to this idea of liberty and property. So that really becomes the rallying cry. And people start to accuse the British Parliament of trying to enslave them, that the British government was trying to enslave the American colonists. And this was something that was very palpable to the American colonists, because remember, slavery is indeed a thing that exists in all 13 American colonies. So this idea that somehow they could be the colonists could be enslaved, that was causing a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and a lot of anger. Politicians and merchants in England reacted to the alarm in the American demonstrations and petitions. And in March of 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. But in response to the repealing of the Stamp Act, meaning they repealed it, it no longer was a law, they passed a second act called the Declaratory Act. And this was an act which asserted that Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies was absolute in all cases whatsoever. So despite the fact that the protests and everything did lead to the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament is still asserting its authority to tax. Okay, so Charles Townshend, who was British chief financial minister, proposed new taxes under the revenue tax of 1767. And this will establish new taxes, or also what is sometimes referred to as duties. Duties and taxes are the same thing, on things like tea, glass, lead, paper, painters' colors, all of these really important imported goods that got brought to the colonies. And they were to be paid by the importer, but that cost would be passed on to the consumer in the retail price of the product. The Townshend duties, they were not especially burdensome, but the principle they embodied, this taxation extracted through trade duties, looked different to the colonists in the wake of the Stamp Act. A controversial provision of the Townshend duties directed that some of the revenue generated would be used to pay the salaries of the colonial royal governors. And so this was obviously very difficult for the colonists, because now you have these taxes that are being imposed upon you. And not only that, part of that tax money is going to pay the salaries of those colonial governors, which means that those colonial governors will be incentivized to enforce this tax. The Townshend, who was Britain's chief financial minister, remember, hoped that the measure would strengthen the governor's position as well as curb the growing independence of the colonial assemblies. The New York Assembly refused to enforce Parliament's Quartering Act of 1765, which they argued was effectively a tax levied without consent because it required New Yorkers to pay money by order of Parliament. So all of these things are eventually going to lead to protests. So the Townshend duties, though, even though they were not necessarily burdensome to the colonists, they were an extension in the minds of the colonists of these other taxes that were being imposed by the British government. And you're starting to see different colonial assemblies, like the New York Assembly, refusing to enforce acts of Parliament, like the Quartering Act, which was the example that I just gave. So resistance is mounting. So in response to the Townshend duties, there was a non-consumption agreement, essentially a boycott that was put in place of British goods. So keep in mind that the Townshend duties, these were taxes on imported goods. They were goods that the colonists had become very much accustomed to getting from the mother country. But the boycott, this non-consumption pact that starts to be created amongst the colonists, becomes really important for generating a certain level of patriotism within the colonies. And one of the leading supporters of the non-consumption pact and the boycott was a group that called themselves the Daughters of Liberty. And these were women that created like sewing circles and dedicated themselves to creating homemade goods, goods that were made in the American colonies, so that the colonists would not have to buy the imported goods from England. So this, again, is a way for them to express their patriotism. It's a way for the women to get involved in this resistance movement. Now, the boycotts, these non-consumption pacts that a lot of the colonies had made, become a success, and British imports into the colonies will fall by 40%. And of course, this is going to anger the British government, who is trying to generate revenue to recover from the cost of the 7 Years' War. Okay, so all of these protests will eventually lead to the event known as the Boston Massacre. So the backstory to the Boston Massacre is in the fall of 1768, 3,000 uniformed British troops arrived to occupy Boston. Now, the reason why they arrived was because they were there to protect the Townshend duties. They were there to protect the merchants that were engaging in the trade with these particular goods. They were there to protect the customs house. And As they're there, they are, obviously they're armed. There's a military presence on the street, and tensions start to rise. And in March of 1770, a group of protesters start to taunt some of the British guards that were in front of the customs house, guarding the customs house. And basically, an altercation takes place. The protesters are, yelling names at the British soldiers, and they're throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. But the British soldiers are armed, and the protesters are unarmed. And the British soldiers one of them decides to fire into this unarmed crowd. And the end result is that there will be 11 men wounded and 5 that will be killed, including one African American by the name of Crispus Attucks. The Boston Massacre, as the event soon became known, was over in minutes. Hutchinson, who is the colonial governor at the time, tried to respond in a way that would prevent further violence. But the Sons of Liberty made sure that those 5 colonial victims had funerals that were befitting heroic martyrs. 8 jailed British soldiers and their captain, Thomas Preston, was brought before a court of law in the fall of 1770, where they were defended by John Adams and Josiah Quincy, patriots who believed strongly that even unpopular defendants deserved a fair trial. The 5-day trial resulted in the acquittal for Preston and all but 2 of the soldiers who were convicted of manslaughter, branded on the thumbs and released. But despite the fact that they were acquitted, this particular incident becomes a rally cry for patriotism throughout the colonies. You're going to get this image that you see here on this slide that will be circulated throughout the colonies, and you'll look up here at the very top. It's titled "The Bloody Massacre," and this image was created by a silversmith named Paul Revere, who really wanted to play up this incident as being an act of aggression of this empire against these unarmed colonists. And so this leaflet circulates throughout the colonies, and this is going to generate a whole lot of anger towards the British. Okay, so there is a repeal of the Townshend Duties that happens in 1770. And this was in response to the Boston Massacre, to the protests, etc. Now they repeal taxes on all imported goods except for tea, So they kept the tax on tea. And this will lead to an end of the boycotts, and there will be a brief period of stability in the colonies. There will be an increase in trade between 1770 and 1771. But in 1772, several incidents once again brought the conflict with England into sharp focus. One of these incidents was the burning of the Gaspee, a British Navy ship chasing down suspected smugglers off the coast of Rhode Island. So, as I mentioned before, smuggling was a real, common occurrence in the American colonies. And I said a lot of it had to do with its proximity to other colonial powers like the French and the Spanish. And it was also in order to avoid having to pay taxes to the British government that a lot of these smuggling operations took place. So when this British Navy ship that was, like I said, sent off the coast of Rhode Island to chase down these smugglers was burned, the British Investigating Commission failed to arrest anybody, but announced that if the suspects were found, they would be sent to England for trial on charges of high treason, a decision that in the minds of the colonists seemed to fly in the face of traditional English right to trial by jury of somebody's peers. So in response to this, um, a, a network, a political network is created throughout the colonies, a political network called the Committees of Correspondence. And these are organized political networks. They're formed to carry information throughout the colonies so that you could receive information, you could discuss that information with your colonial assemblies, etc., and then you could act on political news. So again, this was another way in which the American colonies were unique in that, first you have the fact that you have a high literacy rate, so a lot of people could read a lot of this political news that was being circulated, but you also had these communication networks that were set up to share information rapidly throughout the colonies. So you would have these riders that would get on horses and they would go from one colony to another, sharing information so that people were informed of what was happening very quickly. And this was important, and the burning of the Gaspee sets that off because the colonists are completely stunned by this idea that if the people who committed this act were caught, that they would be tried in England, because again, this seems to go against all common law, that you are supposed to have the right to be tried by a jury of your peers. So by 1773, as a result of these committees of correspondence, political news is traveling very fast through the colonies. And you start to get this symbol, this join or die symbol, being resurrected by the American colonists. It was originally created actually for the French and Indian War. And what you see here is a snake that represents the various colonies. You see here New England being one, represented here as one colony, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And this idea of joining or die, this is a call to arms. This is a call to join together for a cause, right? And so this particular symbol, like I said, that was originally created for the French and Indian War is going to get resurrected in the early 1770s to try to get people to join together in this cause against the British Empire. Okay, so in 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act. This was passed in response to the fact that the British East India Company was struggling. They were losing money and they had a bunch of surplus tea that they wanted to unload into the American colonies. So what this act did was it essentially gave the East India Company, the British East India Company, a monopoly on the tea trade into the colonies. This was in reaction to the fact that a lot of the colonists actually bought illegal, imported, smuggled in Dutch tea. And so the East India Company comes up with this plan to basically get a monopoly on the tea trade. So it allowed for the East India Company to travel all the way from India directly to the American colonies without having to stop in England first. And then it set up certain merchants in the colonies that only had the sole authority to sell the tea. And this angered the colonists because even though the Tea Act did not raise the price of the tea, they felt that this was a trick to force the colonists to pay the duties that the Townshend Act still had on tea. So remember how I said the Townshend Act had been repealed? Well, it had been repealed, but it had been repealed all but for the tea tax. So essentially what was happening was the East India Company, in its effort to try to generate revenue for itself and to compete with the Dutch smugglers, sets up this system where they are the sole providers of tea in the American colonies. So this is making people angry, despite the fact that it doesn't increase the price of tea in any way. They still felt as if this was a way to try to force that tax to be paid. And this is an image of the tar and feathering of John Malcolm. And this was, again, in response to this tax on tea. We actually saw this image earlier in black and white. But you'll notice here you see tea being poured out as kind of like an homage to the Boston Tea Party, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You see here this Liberty tree. You see a noose hanging from the Liberty tree. And you see this man who is a tax collector being tarred and feathered and being forced to drink the tea. So, and if you look at the faces on the people who are carrying this out, I mean, you really get a sense of sort of this almost like, sick delight that these people got in, torturing people that were carrying out these laws. So, and the Sons of Liberty really become the group that is held responsible for a lot of these attacks on people like the customs officers or the tax collectors or the governors, etc. Okay, so the Tea Act is going to set off a very famous protest that takes place in the Boston Harbor in December of 1773. This, of course, is the Boston Tea Party. So the Boston Tea Party, it happens when three ships that were carrying English tea arrive in Boston in November of 1773. They cleared the customs and unloaded their cargoes, but not the tea. And the reason why they didn't unload the tea is because they were aware of all of the protests that were happening at the time. Pressure continued to build in Boston as Hutchinson, again the royal governor, demanded that the tea duty be paid before the ships returned to England. The tea sat for 20 days on the ship. And on December 16th of 1773, a group of Boston citizens disguised as Indians boarded the ships and dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. This was the equivalent of 340 chests of tea, the cost of which at that time period was 10,000 pounds, which would be the equivalent of $4 million today. So this was huge. This was a massive loss for the East India Company. And this was done it was done at night, but it was done with a bunch of bystanders standing around, all cheering them on. And this was in the minds of the British government, this was really the last straw for them. And they wanted to put an end to these protests, and they wanted to assert their authority after this in the American colonies. Okay, so the British Prime Minister, a man by the name of Lord North, response to the Boston Tea Party was very swift and stern. Within 3 months, Parliament passed the first of the Coercive Acts, 4 laws meant to punish Massachusetts for the destruction of the tea, soon known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. So even though, again, I sometimes will show these boring slides, this is, again, another slide that is very important to understand, because these are the laws that were passed that will lead us, basically, us into the American Revolution. So the Boston Tea Party happens. The British East India Company loses what today would be the equivalent of millions of dollars, and they pass these 4 acts of Parliament. The first is the Boston Port Act. This basically closed the Boston harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. And how was it supposed to be paid? It was supposed to be paid through the colonial government, right? So through the taxing of the people of Massachusetts. And this was huge for a lot of the merchants in Boston, right? Because obviously, if the harbor is closed, they cannot send their goods out of the harbor. Secondly, the Massachusetts Government Act was passed. So governors, colonial council would be appointed and not elected. So from here on out, basically there was martial law declared on the colony of Massachusetts. So governors and the colonial council will be appointed. Who will they be appointed by? The king and parliament. The governor can now appoint all judges in the colony and sheriffs and officers of the court. And no town meeting could be held without the governor's approval. So, as I said, it's essentially a martial law situation in which the governor has complete and total authority over the colony. This goes against all of the colonial principles of self-governance. And so this is going to anger everybody living in the Massachusetts colony, and not just the Massachusetts colony, but other colonies as well that understand the significance of losing local control, local political control. Number 3 was the Imperial Administration of Justice Act. This was, again, kind of an addendum to the declaration that was made after the burning of the Gaspee. And this basically says that all colonists accused of any kind of capital crime, essentially a felony, would be tried in England. So again, this goes against all of the common law, British common law principles, which say that you have the right to be tried by a jury of your peers. And then number 4, the Quartering Act. And this was an act that permitted military commanders to house soldiers wherever necessary. And this was already had been an act that had been passed in certain colonies. And we talked about this briefly a while ago, where the New York Colonial Assembly refused to honor this act. But this was an act that angered colonists throughout the 13 colonies, because this required that if a military commander orders it in your town, you are required by law to put up soldiers that come to your home and demand food and demand a place to sleep. And then also part of the Quartering Act was that a military governor was basically put in charge of Boston, a man by the name of General Thomas Gage. So now you've got this martial law situation throughout the colony of Massachusetts. You have this military governor, essentially, that's put in charge of the city of Boston. And you basically have Massachusetts being put on total lockdown. In addition to that, all of the colonies are having to deal with the Administration of Justice Act and also the Quartering Act. So this is not just going to anger the colonists in Massachusetts and in Boston, but it's also going to anger the colonists all up and down the 13 colonies. So this is eventually going to lead to the first Continental Congress being assembled. This will happen in September of 1774. This is where the representatives from the colonies came together to discuss what to do about the intolerable acts and the behavior and the aggression that the British government was asserting, particularly over the colony of Massachusetts. They met for 7 weeks in Philadelphia. They produced a Declaration of Rights, but they didn't overtly challenge British authority. They also proposed a limited boycott of trade. So like the original Townshend Duties, where you had this boycott on British imported goods. The First Continental Congress is proposing reinstating that to a certain degree, so that it sends a message to the British government that we don't need their goods, that we could produce our own goods in the colonies. And they agreed after much debate that they would reconvene in May to reassess the situation. Now, at the First Continental Congress, there was a lot of disagreement over how to approach the situation. Obviously, the delegation from Massachusetts really wanted to see a very stern reaction to the Intolerable Acts. But there were other delegates, like some people from Philadelphia, some people from New York, who were worried about their business partnerships and didn't really want to overtly challenge the authority of the British government. So there was a lot of debate back and forth there. But this really sets sort of the precedent for the colonial Continental Congress that will see basically govern throughout the entire period of the American Revolution. I also have on the optional resources in your module a link to a video. It's pretty short. It's only, I think, 3 minutes long or something, but it is a reenactment of the Continental Congress, a little snippet from there. And you kind of get a sense of that tension and that disagreement in this first delegation. Okay, so the Continental Congress had made this Declaration of Rights. They had proposed this limited boycott, and they were going to reconvene again in May. However, they will never reconvene because Lexington and Concord is going to take place in April of 1775. So Lexington and Concord basically is um, the result of the British going out into the Boston countryside in an effort to try to find what they thought was a storage of weapons and munitions. And they were going to recover this from Concord. And Concord was a little town on the outskirts of Boston. And so basically, what happens is you've got this military governor, Thomas Gage, and he sends these troops out into the countryside. About 700 British soldiers are sent out into the countryside again to raid this munitions and arms storage in Concord. The colonists had this alarm system that they had organized. Again, remember going back to the committees of correspondence, the colonists were very organized in their communication networks. And so this alarm system gets set off to warn the people in both Lexington and Concord, because Lexington is a town on the way to Concord, that the British are going to be coming out into the countryside. And for a very long time, historians have kind of wondered how did they know that the British were organizing this movement? And it turns out that it's very plausible, actually, that it was actually Thomas Gage's wife, a woman by the name of Margaret Gage, who was actually a colonist herself. She had been born in New Jersey, and she probably was a spy for the Patriots. And so we think that she was the one that alerted the Patriot Joseph Warren about the raid at Lexington and Concord, and she's the reason why these writers are going to go out and warn the countryside in advance. The most famous writer that goes out to warn the countryside, of course, is Paul Revere. There was also William Dawes, and they were joined later on by Samuel Prescott. So there were several groups of writers, and they alert the Minutemen. Now, who are the Minutemen? The Minutemen are essentially the militia, the local militia, the armed citizens, and they have organized to go out and meet these British soldiers. And that's exactly what happens on the Lexington Green. So you've got this confrontation between these armed citizens and the obviously armed British soldiers on the Lexington Green, and there was a shot that was fired. Now, this is known as the shot that was heard round the world because it still is unclear who it was that fired the shot. Some people think it might have been an accidental fire of a musket. But no matter what, the reason why it's called the shot that is heard around the world is because it is the shot that sets off the American Revolution. Because once that shot is fired, a whole volley of shots get fired back and forth between this armed citizen militia and the trained, uniformed British soldiers. And at the result of this confrontation at Lexington is that 8 colonists will die and 10 were wounded. And the British soldiers continue on to Concord. Now, by the time they get to Concord, another militia force has gone out to meet them there. And they actually set up kind of a trap for them near this covered bridge. And that will eventually lead to the death of 2 more colonists and 3 British soldiers. Now, what ends up happening is that the British, after Concord, are forced to retreat because they are being surrounded and ambushed by colonists. And they begin to retreat back to Boston and they're marching down the road. You know, they're very noisy and obviously they're easy to see because they have these bright red uniforms on. And by the end of the day, 73 British soldiers will be dead and 49 colonists, and the Revolutionary War will have begun. Now, the significant thing about this particular day, not only obviously does the American Revolution begin, but you start to see kind of a preview of what this war is going to be about. The American colonists, despite the fact that they are untrained, just militiamen essentially, they know the terrain. They weren't afraid to use guerrilla war style tactics. They weren't afraid to ambush the British. And the British, they were, professionally trained soldiers. They're marching, they're easy targets. And so you can see that at the end of the day, in the Lexington and Concord, you have more British soldiers dead than you do colonists. And the reason for that is because the colonists were willing to use this guerrilla style warfare on the British. I also have a link to the story of this day on that instructor video resources. So if you're interested in watching a video on that, you can click on that and check that out. Okay, so here you see a map of the Boston area. You'll notice Boston right here, and then Lexington over here, Concord over here. So this map shows the path of the riders that went out to warn the countryside, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and you can kind of see their route. Paul Revere was actually briefly captured and then released by the British. Lexington Green, you can see here, is considered a British victory. The Concord battle is considered an American victory. After Concord, the British are forced to retreat back to Boston, and that is when they are ambushed by a lot of American militiamen, and that's where a lot of their deaths will take place. The other thing you can see on this map is Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. We're going to be talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill in the next lecture, but you can see here its proximity also to Boston. So it gives you a real sort of overview of the landscape around Boston. Here's the Boston Harbor. You'll notice all the various rivers as well. So, one of the first things that happens at the onset of the American Revolution is that there is a question about the slaves in the American colonies. And the British realized very early on that they could use the slave population that existed in the American colonies to their advantage. And British military commander by the name of Lord Dunmore is the first to come up with this idea. He creates what he calls the Ethiopian Regiment of basically slaves that have escaped their enslavement and they have come to serve for the British Army. And basically, how the British did this is they promised the slaves that served in their army freedom after they had carried out their service. So by the end of the war, about 10,000 of these American slaves will leave the American colonies and they will be taken to Nova Scotia up in Canada and also Sierra Leone over in Africa. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that takes place during the American Revolution, is that you do have African American enslaved people that are going to be enticed to fight for the British because, of course, they are promised their freedom. So that's an important sort of subplot to this entire story moving forward. So that's it for now. We will resume talking about the American Revolution in Chapter 5, Part 2. See you then.